Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. Recently, I uploaded a video for one of my Monday minis about a piece that I made back in 2002. The piece was called Evolution, and it was a hybrid of my 500 vest pattern, along with the thought, how long can I make this vest based on the length of yardage that I had to work with? As it turned out, I got a good amount of length down to below the knee or maybe even mid-calf. The idea of a walking vest like this is that it moves freely around the hips and does not interfere with walking. A walking vest allows unimpeded walking. To do that, side vents become really important. And what that means is that side seams should split apart below a certain point. So let's look at the pattern for my 600 walking vest. An extension is added to each half of the garment, front and back, starting just above the dot, which indicates the end of the side seam, 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeters, and extending out past the side seam an additional 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. Those extensions allow the front face of the garment to be visible when the vents flip and swing while the garment is worn. Finishing off the inside edge of the vent is much easier when there's fabric to work with. Side seams are sewn up to the dot indicated on the pattern, and the rest is left open. The side seam allowances are typically finished in whatever method is appropriate, depending on the fabric, what equipment you have, and if the piece will be lined. I talked a lot about seam finish options in previous videos. In this hand-woven walking vest, the side seam allowances were finished off with a serger. Because the piece is fully lined, the serging isn't really visible unless you look for it. In this hand-woven walking vest, a plaid created from kid mohair, cotton, and some novelty yarn, the side seam allowances are finished off with bias strips of Nylon Tricot, which I covered in another video. In this walking vest with hand-woven tapestry inlaid yokes, the commercial wool for the lower part was stable enough that the lining could be brought right up to the edge to cover the turn under for the vent. So no seam allowance finishing was necessary. Once the side seam finishes are in place, all that's left is to finish off the long edge of the vent extensions. Again, whatever is appropriate for your fabric, use Nylon Tricot or serging, or if the vest will be unlined, try a Hong Kong seam finish. I would encourage using a lining for two reasons. One is the construction of the 500 vest and the 600 walking vest use the lining to support the underarm. We covered the underarm construction in a previous video. More importantly though, the lining allows the vest to fall smoothly and freely over lower body parts, which is all part of the point of this type of silhouette. Before the vents are permanently turned back, the hems must be turned up. It will be necessary to finish the lower edge of the garment in 3 sections. That would be the center back and the 2 front panels. There's the center back and the 2 front panels. Use the same type of seam finish for consistency. Turn up the lower edge and hem as we discussed in the video on hemming. Turn in the vent extensions on the fold line starting at the dot and hand stitch them down. I like to use a blind catch stitch here as well to attach the vent extensions so no ridge shows on the front. We talked about this stitch in the video on hemming. So this all sounds pretty straightforward, easy enough. And you might ask, Daryl, why do we need a video on this? Well, it gets more complicated, of course, when you add a lining, especially to a hand woven. If you've watched enough of my videos, you know that hand woven fabric has a mind of its own and usually grows and gives as it's worn. So lining a jacket means not attaching the lining to the lower edge of the jacket to allow the hand woven fabric to do what it wants to do. The walking vest is a lot longer than a regular jacket, so this is even more important. Fusing a stabilizer to the back of the vest fabric will prevent this, of course, and that is an option. But I rather like the swing and drape of a fabric that just slides and moves as you walk, giving your stride some sass. Sometimes a fusible underlining will cause the fabric to be more stable and maybe less fluid. Obviously, if you are using a commercial fabric and that fabric is stable, you can just bring the lining to the edge of the vents, slip stitch it in place like I did here, and call it a day. But a better way, especially for hand-woven fabrics with minds of their own, is to allow the lining to just hang freely of the outer fabric. But with the vent exposing the inside of the garment, you won't want the lining to be visible through the vent opening. In the shadow weave walking vest called Evolution, I serged the edges of the lining side seam allowances and long edge of the vent, stitched to the dot and pressed open, the same as I did for the outer fabric. In the checked mohair walking vest, I sewed the lining side seam with a French seam. We talked about constructing linings with French seams in a separate video. There are lots of options here. Because the vent will need to be pressed open, clip the French seam allowance diagonally into the dot to release the side seam allowance. So you press it to one side, but also press the vents open. In this vest, the lining was turned towards the wrong side on the fold line, as we did on the outer vest. And then I turned the extension under itself because it was such a ravelly thing. And then I hand stitched it in place once the lower edge was turned up. You could also machine top stitch the vent extensions in the lining once the lower edge was turned up. The lining, hem, and the extensions can all be machine stitched. So how do you keep the lining hanging free to let the hand woven do its thing, but keep it anchored so it doesn't constantly peek out from the vent? French tacks. Like French seams and Hong Kong seam finishes, many of our sewing terms are borrowed from cultures who excelled at these skills. I use the terms with reverence and respect. A French tack anchors the lining to the garment, but still allows some internal movement. A true French tack is a bit laborious, creating little half hitches up a few lengths of thread. I prefer the method of creating a thread chain. If you crochet, this is just a crocheted chain using sewing thread. You can see here in both of these garments that I have carefully added French tacks to keep the lining anchored to either side of the vents. Each tack is long enough to allow movement and growth of the hand-woven fabric, but not long enough to allow the lining to float out of the vent so it's seen on the exterior of the garment. The tack is maybe ½ an inch or 1.2 centimeters to 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters long. And the tack is repeated at the top of the vent to keep the lining anchored to the garment, but again, still allow movement between the two layers. I'll demonstrate how to create this tack. I use regular sewing thread, doubled, and then passed through the needle, creating 4 lengths of thread. I pass all 4 lengths through a cake of beeswax for strength, knot the end, grab the smallest amount of garment fabric with the needle and bury the knot. Go back in and pick up the same amount of fabric and create a loop. If you know how to crochet and you have a crochet hook handy, just crochet a chain the length you want. If you don't have a crochet hook, use your fingers. Reach your fingers into the loop and grab the needle thread, pulling through another loop. Snug up on each subsequent loop, creating a thread chain. Once you've reached the desired length, pass the needle completely through the last loop and pull tight. This finishes off the chain. Take the needle and grab the smallest amount of lining to attach the thread chain or French tack to the lining fabric. Grab the same amount of fabric and go back in and out again. Pull tight and knot off the thread. One more thing. The bottom of the side seam, where it stops at the top of the vent, is a very weak spot, and after many wearings will start to pull apart. Depending on the strength of the thread that you used to sew the seam and the stability of the outer fabric, the stress on the lower edge of the side seam can even start to distort the fabric where it comes together at the top of the vent. I added a small triangle of ultra suede to the outside of the Evolution vest to support the top of the vent. Leather can work here as well. You can add this same idea to the underside of the vent instead. I've seen garment makers use thread bar tacks to support across the top of the vent on the wrong side. And I've also seen a tip where someone used the metal bar from a hook and eye to help stabilize the top of the vent again on the wrong side. If you are really worried, you can always fuse a small square of fusible interfacing just over the dot on each half of the garment before stitching the side seam. Whenever I have a student complete a walking vest in class, it is such a joy to watch them twirl around and strut their stuff. This particular silhouette is as eye-catching as it is flattering. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.